Hi everybody. Is it sane to believe in something without having evidence for it? And what do we mean by evidence anyway? Is it sane to talk to God or an imaginary friend or whatever that some other people don't believe in? And furthermore, is it or is it not sane to deviate from random social norms for what happens to be considered acceptable at the moment? Well, I'm now going to pick up where I left off in previous videos and move into this very complicated subject. I'm not going to try to cover it completely today. I don't think anyone could in a lifetime, but I am going to talk about it a little bit. As you may know, there has been a lot of debate going on about this lately, mostly in the religious discussions with Hannibal, James, and others, and also a little bit in the polyamory discussion between James and myself. First of all, what do we even mean with sanity? The problem here is that there is no really objective definition of the concept of sanity. Sanity seems to be within a more or less arbitrary social norm for how one's mind is supposed, according to other people, to operate, while insanity is to deviate from such arbitrary norms. With arbitrary, I do not mean meaningless. Such norms can mean everything in the world in the narrative that the culture is currently making, and it can also be reasonable. Take, for example, depression as a concept. There is no clear line between being depressed and not being depressed, and the new edition of DSM does acknowledge this. DSM has changed from absolutes of either having an insanity or disorder or whatever, or being sane, into instead having sliding scales with how much you have of one problem or another. And I think this is a vast improvement because those absolutes make it so much more arbitrary whether or not you have crossed the line. But either way, this thing that we more or less arbitrarily define as depression is a rather horrible thing. Surely we can all agree that on the whole, all else being equal, I was going to say that all else being equal, it is better to be happy than to be unhappy, and that crushing despair is a bad thing. And, well, all things being equal, that's the wrong way of putting it. Let's say that under reasonable circumstances, it is better to be happy than to be unhappy. There are also some circumstances where one could argue that it would be insane to not be depressed. I mean, when people you care about die or get tortured or whatever, are you really supposed to be happy in that situation? So it's, and I also read the study somewhere. I wish I had saved it. I'm going to try to look it up later. But anyway, a study that claimed that when you get medicated for depression, you are more likely to accept injustice. I think this is really true, because such medication does take the edge of despair and anger and that sort of thing, or at least they sometimes do. And these negative emotions can sometimes be really needed to claw our way out of the pit that we have gotten into. I'm speaking metaphorically here, of course. In most situations, however, this thing that we call depression is rather undesirable, and it is reasonable to assume that on the whole people want to get rid of their depressions, that it is reasonable to label it as an undesired state of being. Moving on to schizophrenia, that is probably something that is real in itself, not just a deviation from social norms about how you're supposed to function. I mean, let's make an analogy to physical health. Being able to walk or run fast enough, that's an arbitrary norm for how much speed you're supposed to be able to work up, and how agile you are, that can be arbitrary social norm as well. If some places can only be accessed by ladders, it's a matter of normativity that everyone are supposed to be agile enough to get up on those ladders, and if you can't, you're considered disabled. But this is all a matter of arbitrary social norms for how high functionality in a certain field you're supposed to have. But if your leg is actually broken, that is not arbitrary, that is an objective physical condition. And the same thing is very likely to be the case with schizophrenia. I'm not all that into neurology, but I think science has a rather good understanding of schizophrenia and related problems today, and this will get better. I and many with me hope that within a few decades all of DSM will be changed, that we will have objective criteria and clear distinctions between what is actually objective problems and what is a matter of social norms for how we're supposed to function. But anyway, one thing I really want to make clear is that schizophrenia is not about hearing voices. Pretty much everybody hears voices. When we sleep, we call it dreams. When we are awake, we call it fantasies. But pretty much everybody have them. The problem with schizophrenia is a inability to distinguish between stimuli from the outside and stimuli from the inside. And by the way, that's only one of the symptoms of schizophrenia. It's a really complex disorder. When people talk to God, a lot of people, religious as well as non-religious, say that here we have to make a choice. Either God exists and then it's sane to talk to God, or God does not exist and then it is not sane to talk to God. Then it is the same thing as schizophrenia. But I strongly disagree with this dichotomy. Yes, there are indeed some people who have schizophrenia or similar and confuse this with talking to God. It is very likely that there are theological standpoints and religious cults of various kinds that has gotten started in this particular way. Remember that the phenomenon of schizophrenia has existed throughout all of human history, and probably before that. It is very likely that our pre-human ancestors could have this kind of condition as well. But it doesn't have to be this thing. As I explained in my 5x3 compass for reality, we have to distinguish between physical reality, internal reality, and social reality. And when people talk about divine existence outside of time and space, it doesn't even have to be part of any of those three. And then we have the whole thing with whether or not outside of time and space is a metaphor in itself and therefore being part of social reality. But never mind that. The bottom line here is that whether or not there is any kind of God outside of time and space, it is still very obvious that various gods do exist in various personal and social realities. Of course they can be meaningful, and of course you can talk with them, and you don't have to label this as insane. It can be very meaningful and fruitful to talk with entities that exist in your own internal reality. Whether or not this is deities or make-believe friends or whatever, they can tell you very meaningful and interesting things that really help you. Of course, this input, in the case that it doesn't come from outside of time and space, then it comes from yourself and from your culture and from the shared models of thinking of yourself and the people who share your belief, whatever that belief may be. So talking to God can still be meaningful whether or not any God exists outside of your own mind and the minds of your fellow worshippers. And as for God physically existing, I think there are, even among fundamentalists, there are very few who claim that God actually in physical reality exists, that there will be some bearded man on a cloud or something like that. Nobody believes that except for small children, not even fundamentalists. So what it all boils down to is what is or isn't socially accepted. And a lot of religious people are trying to make it socially unaccepted and, if you will, insane to not belong to their particular religion, or at least to not belong to a religion at all. They are trying to demonize people who are not religious, self-identified atheists and otherwise. And in the same way, some atheists are trying to define being religious as being insane. Can't we just live and let live? Get rid of those totalitarian narratives where it all has to be one or the other. In the previous discussion about polyamory, we were talking about the Overton window, that we have a rather wide range of ideas that are possible to have, and then a much smaller range of ideas that are accepted. This is the Overton window. If you're outside of that window, you're considered insane or similar. And very much of discursive struggles in the society I mean, discussions about discussions and so on. It's very much about moving that window one way or another. And people often take more extreme positions than they actually believe in order to shame the people on the other side and make sure that the people on one's own side can be free from shame. It would be good if we could have this window be a bit larger, that we can accept a wider range of discourse. But for this to be possible, for this to be anything else than everybody just shouting at each other, it has to be accompanied with a little bit of being critical to one's own position and one's own thinking. Because when we don't label people insane and they label us insane, they get a really crappy advantage, a really low advantage, but it can still be awfully efficient. We have this really sad thing with, I think it's called the golden mean fallacy, that if two persons have opposite positions, then one of them is probably just as right as the other one, so the truth is in between. So if we have fundamentalists who claim that I, who don't belong to religion, deserve to be tortured and raped forever in hell, and this will also happen, and I'm insane and immoral for not belonging to their religion, and I say that, well, I disagree with your position, but can't we just respect each other? Then a lot of people will think that, well, of course the fundamentalists are better people than me. Of course they deserve to live more than I do. But to be fair, I should only be tortured for a few years and raped every day for a few years for not belonging to their religion, not forever. Ugh. And this is one of the main reasons why a lot of people want to call religion insane, to push that Overton window and to push that golden mean fallacy away. All in all, I think that mankind is gradually growing up and getting more nuanced perspectives. But this is a very hard struggle, and we have a long way to go. And meanwhile, the concept of sanity is something that we have to keep struggling about. The way I see the development, we have three main stages. First, the theocratic stage around the Dark Ages and before and after that, with simply, if you belong to the party line, if you believe what the authorities tell you to believe, then you are saved, but if not, then you are lost. And you don't have to distinguish even between outside stimuli and inside stimuli. So schizophrenia is not even a problem in itself. But the voices you hear have to tell you the right thing, or if there is a conflict, you must make sure that your side is the winning side. If that is accomplished, then your voices comes from God. But if you fail, then the voices come from the devil and you deserve to be burned at the stake. Thankfully, we as a society has left this stage, and then we have this had this medicalizing perspective where homosexuality were considered a mental disorder, and in the Soviet Union, not being a communist was considered a mental disorder. You can be considered disordered for being religious or for not being religious or whatever. This is the same basic bullshit as the theocratic bullshit of the Dark Ages, but it's toned down. It is not as bad, and it is at least trying to pretend to be based on empirical reality. The question now is the third stage that I think we are approaching. We're not there yet, but we are approaching it, where we get more objective criteria, and these criteria can be in a biological sense, like with schizophrenia, and they can be in a cause and effect sense, like I described with depression. How your state of mind affect yourself and your way of interacting with society at large. But we really have to keep being very careful about what ideologies about how things are supposed to be that gets inscribed into this whole paradigm. But all in all, I think we're going in the right direction. And there will always be lines drawn about what reasonably can be believed and what can't. But I think we're getting more liberal with them on the whole, and more accurate in defining why something should be designated as insane or not. But of course, there are a lot of struggles to return to the old systems, especially the medicalizing perspective, but also the theocratic. There's a lot of respect for religion in our society, and that's not a bad thing in itself, but this respect very often isn't limited to respecting people's right to tell themselves and other stories and believe in them as long as they don't hurt people. It very often includes respect for condemnations of others. Like, we should repress homosexuals because certain Christians consider it to be against their theology. I mean, quote, against God's will, unquote, and so on. And the very idea that it's okay to judge people and condemn people based on theology or ideology. We have a lot of ideologies prone to condemning wide sweeping categories of people. These last few days I've been in a discussion on a feminist forum where there were a lot of people were celebrating some song about how cool it is to hate men. And they argued that, oh, but this shouldn't be seen in a bad way. And I was like, hello, of course it's going to be seen in a bad way. What the fuck do you expect? But, I mean, this is the exact same thing as with religious people thinking that, oh, but these bad parts of the Bible, people shouldn't take them in the way they are written. They should just be seen as something good instead because I like this ideology, etc., etc., etc. So I think I'm just going to leave it at this for now. You're very welcome to come with thoughts, feelings, comments, constructive criticism, and so on. Have a nice day and live long and